Goldman Sachs. It's a name that can represent many different things depending on your perspective. So if you're a Bernie Sanders supporter, Goldman Sachs reflects the worst of Wall Street's greed, selfishness, and lawbreaking, the biggest of the big banks that must be destroyed at all costs, or at least broken up. To Hillary Clinton, Goldman Sachs is a company that really knows how to show its appreciation for a well-delivered speech.
Look, I made speeches to lots of groups. I told them what I thought. I answered questions.
But did you have to be paid $675,000?
Well, I don't know. That's what they offered.
To Donald Trump, Goldman Sachs is just another one of the countless American banks that have wised up and will no longer lend him money. And to high-ranking government officials in the Treasury Department or at the Fed, Goldman Sachs is likely a fondly remembered past and quite possibly future employer. During the 2016 election season, Wall Street has taken a lot of heat, much of it directed at Goldman Sachs. Ever since the financial crisis, when Goldman and other big banks were revealed to have gambled on subprime mortgages and left the rest of us holding the bag and then received billions in government bailouts, Goldman Sachs has become a popular punching bag for critics who argue that the financial industry has too much influence and is a threat to global economic stability. As one of the world's largest investment banks, Goldman is undoubtedly powerful. But are the critics right that Goldman Sachs is worse than that and is actually evil? Let's look at the evidence. The 2008 crash wasn't the first financial crisis Goldman had a not-so-invisible hand in. Far from it. 80 years earlier, the bank launched a series of trading trusts with names like Shenandoah Corporation and the Blue Ridge Corporation, where the bank essentially borrowed money to buy shares in its own trusts to drive up the price, then sold shares in one company to get the money to buy more shares in another of its trusts, driving prices ever higher. It's called leverage-based investment, and it works great as long as stock prices keep rising. But it was really little more than a pyramid scheme, and once gravity kicked in and prices in the last fund in the line headed south, the pyramid came crashing down. Goldman's trusts eventually suffered losses equal to $500 billion in today's dollars, and these losses in turn were a major cause of the Great Depression. Fast forward to the 1990s and replace trusts with tech stocks, and you find Goldman Sachs helping spur another investment bubble. This time, the company used a technique called laddering, which involved taking the latest hot tech company public, but selling initial shares ahead of the IPO to select investors for a discounted price, but only if those investors promised they would buy more shares later on the open market. This gave Goldman traders inside knowledge of future demand for the stock, essentially guaranteeing that the price would go up. And go up it did. In the tech-fueled, day-trading crazed frenzy that characterized the 1990s, laddering allowed Goldman to reap huge profits from IPOs for companies like Webvan, NetZero, and eToys that had never turned a nickel of profit. Well, not for their investors anyway. Goldman's 6% take from these IPOs netted the company hundreds of millions of dollars. After the tech bubble burst, eliminating $5 trillion in wealth from the NASDAQ alone, shareholders repeatedly sued Goldman over the laddering practice. And eventually, in 2005, Goldman agreed to pay $40 million for violations, a penalty dwarfed by the enormous profits the company had made. Lesson learned. So what else was Goldman up to in the 1990s? Well, that's when the company began to wield its substantial influence to successfully lobby for a massive rollback of government regulations on speculation. This included the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been put in place at the height of the Great Depression precisely to limit commercial banks from speculating with investors' money. The argument made by then Goldman CEO Hank Paulson and senior economic policy advisor and former Goldman co-chairman Bob Rubin was that, hey, the banks can police themselves perfectly well, so what's the point of all this pesky government oversight? Beginning in the late 90s, the number of government regulators monitoring Wall Street plummeted, along with the number of criminal complaints brought against bankers, which sets the stage for the next big bubble, the housing crisis of the late 2000s. We know that Goldman's dirty fingerprints were all over the dubious, dangerous, and criminal practices that helped cause the Great Recession. Put simply, Goldman Sachs knowingly bundled shitty subprime loans into so-called collateralized debt obligations and then sold them as grade A investments to customers. Goldman then bet against their own clients by taking out insurance policies for when these investments inevitably cratered. It's like if you owned a racehorse and talked all of your friends into betting on your horse in a race against another horse, but you neglected to mention that your horse only has 3 legs. Then, once all your friends have placed their bets and driven up the odds of the other horse in the race, you place your big bet on that horse. And win! Ha ha! Sorry, suckers! We also know that the resulting economic collapse harmed millions of people and was associated with thousands of suicides as well as hundreds of thousands of additional cancer deaths, while homeowners as well as pensions, charities, trusts, banking clients, and government entities around the world suffered catastrophic financial losses. And then Goldman Sachs, thanks to their political clout, took billions of dollars in bailouts from the US government. Billions that didn't go to help underwater homeowners or any of the other millions of Americans who played no role in causing the financial meltdown, but certainly bore the brunt of it. Internal Goldman emails show that the company's CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, and others knew precisely what they were doing and later lied to Congress about it. Blankfein told Senate investigators that it was investors' fault for not knowing that Goldman Sachs would try to screw them over. This is what's commonly known as the Animal House defense.
You fucked up! You trusted us!
Despite the clear evidence of wrongdoing, no one at Goldman Sachs was ever arrested or even indicted. Why? Oh, I don't know. Maybe it had something to do with the revolving door between Goldman and key government posts held by former Goldman executives, like Hank Paulson, Robert Rubin, Tim Geithner, and others. I'm just spitballing here. And these are just a few of the, shall we say, questionable episodes of financial chicanery and malfeasance that Goldman Sachs has been deeply involved in over the years. Insider trading, stock manipulation, misleading investors, data theft, market rigging, fraud, cozy relationships with repressive foreign dictators. The controversies section of Goldman Sachs' Wikipedia page goes on and on and on. Naturally, the company denies all wrongdoing, except occasionally to place blame on a few bad apples. So yes, Goldman Sachs has a lengthy and troubling history. But does that qualify as evil? After all, no one at Goldman was ever indicted for any of the alleged crimes that led to the market meltdown, so the company can plausibly claim that they never broke the law. And hey, Goldman is just using every tool at its disposal in our capitalist system to make money. Should they be punished just because they play the game better than everyone else? And by having its fingers in financial pies all over the world, isn't Goldman helping to generate market activity, spurring growth and business opportunities? And not just for bankruptcy lawyers, pawn shops, and cancer doctors either. Frankly, even after the fallout from the financial crisis, there's still very little transparency on Wall Street. So we don't really know what shenanigans Goldman Sachs and the other banks are up to. But we do know that these banks are even bigger than before. And knowledgeable observers, including Noam Chomsky, suggest that another financial crisis, again caused by the kind of rampant speculation that is no doubt going on, is right around the corner. It all sounds pretty bad, and it is, but that doesn't mean Goldman Sachs is evil. Evil is a concept more appropriately applied to individual people, and corporations aren't people, no matter what some people say.
Corporations are people, my friend.
So should many of the top-level executives at Goldman and other banks be in jail? Probably. Does Goldman's business model almost necessarily depend on enriching the company by spreading misery among certain segments of the populace? Yeah, it kind of does. And does the stereotype of Wall Street bankers as selfish pricks have any validity? Undoubtedly. But the reality is that even if you break the rules, if those rules are not enforced, they're not really rules. The core of the problem, the real evil, if you want to call it that, is a system that rewards greed, that rewards illegality, that rewards collusion between the government and big banks at the expense of the rest of us, and then compels us to provide a financial backstop for those banks when they gamble recklessly and lose. The solution is to get the government out of the business of enabling this bad behavior and back to doing the job of regulating, trimming the sails of banks that can't be trusted to regulate themselves. Reinstate Glass-Steagall, break up the too-big-to-fail banks, end the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington, D.C., fully fund and beef up the SEC's enforcement capabilities, promote and reward people like New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, who sincerely want to root out corruption in the financial sector. Of course, virtually none of these reforms are on the table because many of the politicians who would have to pass the appropriate legislation are currently feeding at the money trough that's regularly filled up by Goldman Sachs and other banking interests. And that's why the number one priority, if we truly want to end the evil practices that are rife in the financial sector, is to get money out of politics. Because the only way to stop a bad wolf of Wall Street is with a good wolf of Wolfpack.